Democrats are advocating for invoking the 25th Amendment and impeachment to remove President Trump from office. It comes after the president's threat yesterday that the whole civilization will die in Iran. And while President Trump did not follow through on the threat, the list of Democrats seeking his removal continues to grow. Here to break it down is the Hill's White House columnist Niall Stanage. Hey, Niall. So at least 70 Democrats have called for President Trump's cabinet to invoke the 25th Amendment. There's no indication that that is being considered. But how do you think we should consider this, maybe on a messaging standpoint from Democrats?
I think messaging is the key word, Drew. This is really a messaging tactic or a messaging maneuver to try to underscore what Democrats see as an instability on the part of the president. They are trying to dramatize that by suggesting the 25th Amendment should be invoked to essentially kick him out. There is no possibility that that will happen, not least because the cabinet is full of his allies.
And also, in the case of the 25th Amendment being invoked and President Trump being removed from office, it would be, of course, J.D. Vance, the vice president, who would take over. And I don't know if that...
All right, folks, welcome to Dr. John Podcast Right Now. A constitutional crisis is unfolding as a president who refuses to relinquish power collides with a furious Congress, mobilizing its most serious removal mechanisms, a standoff with no parallel in modern American history. Lawmakers are engaged in intense negotiations and floor speeches, while Trump defiantly signals he will never voluntarily step aside, creating a fundamental clash over who holds ultimate power in the U.S. system. The numbers tell a story of extraordinary political mobilization on Capitol Hill. More than 120 members of Congress, including 90 Democrats and a handful of Republicans,
is going to be considered or would be considered a victory by Democrats. But this actually isn't something that's new, right? During the first Trump administration, there was talk of using the 25th Amendment. Is there any difference that we should consider this time around?
I'm not really sure that there is. I mean, obviously that quote that you read out about Iran did spark tremors really across the world, not only in the United States, but that doesn't make the mechanics of removing President Trump any easier. In fact, you could argue that his second-term cabinet is even more tightly comprised of loyalists than it was during his first term.
One notable difference is Marjorie Taylor Greene, formerly a firebrand Republican congresswoman, supporter of President Trump, also calling for the invocation of the 25th Amendment. So that, at least, is something new. What about when it comes to the issue of impeaching the president? We have seen at least one Democrat call for impeachment. Again, this is kind of a messaging issue, especially if Democrats are able to take the House in the midterm elections. What do you think what kind of a dilemma do you think Democrats are going to be faced with when
have officially demanded that Trump leave office through one of three available constitutional mechanisms: resignation, impeachment, or invocation of the 25th Amendment? This is not a fringe movement or a handful of disgruntled lawmakers. This is a substantial portion of the legislative branch, a formalized constituency of accountability advocates who have organized themselves around the specific goal of removing a president they believe has become dangerously unfit for office. Their demands are backed by formal resolutions, procedural maneuvers, and a determination that has only grown stronger with each passing week. The president's response to these demands has been equally unequivocal, through public statements, private communications delivered through allies and aides, and the unmistakable absence of any action that would suggest he's considering resignation.
Deciding how to focus their attention, right? Should they do other things or should they try to impeach the president again?
That is a constant debate in Democratic circles. Would they be better focusing on so-called kitchen table issues, the economy and so forth, or on impeachment? Now, with impeachment, people often get confused between impeachment and removal from office. Donald Trump was obviously impeached twice during his first term. Bill Clinton was impeached. None of them were removed. Neither of them was removed from office. But if Democrats get a House majority, then impeachment becomes much more plausible. Right now, it's hard to see even any Republicans in the House voting for it.
Just wanted to ask quickly before we let you go here on this issue of the ceasefire. It's led to some criticism of President Trump using this moniker Taco Trump, which of course stands for Trump always chickens out. There has been some pushback on that. At least one House Democrat said that she's glad that this
Trump has made it absolutely clear that he will not step down under any circumstances. He has characterized the removal efforts as attacks on democracy itself, framing the congressional accountability advocates as enemies of the people who are trying to overturn the will of the voters. He has vowed never to step aside, using language that brooks no compromise and signals a willingness to fight through every available legal and political avenue to maintain his hold on power. This is not the first time Trump has faced calls for his removal, but the current moment is different in ways that make it far more dangerous.
This strike didn't go through and that people are going to be spared. Should Democrats mock the president here, or be thankful that he didn't follow through on these threats?
Yeah, I think the tackle mocking is a bit questionable. I understand why people do it, obviously. But, I mean, I think there's widespread relief that he did not follow through on the threat. When people thought the threat could comprise anything up to and including use of a nuclear weapon, people are glad that that didn't happen. But there is this trend, and here I do take the point, there is this trend of him making very dramatic threats and then pulling back from them.
All right, we'll leave it at that. Niall Stanage, White House columnist here at The Hill. Thank you.
Thanks, Drew.
And far more consequential. The post-January 6th accountability dynamic has created a political environment where the calls for removal are more organized, more formalized, and more determined than ever before. The 7-article impeachment resolution that has been introduced in the House represents the most comprehensive single accountability document in the current term, listing obstruction of power, abuse of the power of the purse, usurpation of trade and war powers, violations of the First Amendment, unlawful creation of offices, bribery, and corruption as the specific constitutional grounds for the most serious available formal accountability mechanism. The formal resolution is remarkable not just for its scope, but for its specificity. Each article lays out in painstaking detail the specific actions that Trump has taken that are alleged to constitute high crimes and misdemeanors, building a legal case that is designed to withstand constitutional scrutiny and persuade the most reluctant lawmakers that removal is not just politically necessary, but constitutionally required. The existence of this document, filed in the official legislative record, represents a formal judgment by a significant portion of the House that the most serious available formal accountability mechanism is warranted by the accumulated conduct of the president. This is not noise. This is not theater. This is the constitutional process being deployed in its most potent form. The 25th Amendment dimension of the congressional explosion adds another layer of constitutional complexity to the power struggle. Democratic members and some Republican voices have been urging the Vice President and the Cabinet to invoke the incapacity declaration mechanism, which would allow for the immediate transfer of presidential power without the multi-step legislative process required by the impeachment pathway. The demands have taken the form of formal letters and resolutions, adding a constitutionally sophisticated dimension to the congressional explosion that goes beyond the more familiar impeachment process. But the cabinet has not executed the mechanism, and that non-execution is the single most directly relevant accountability fact for understanding why the explosion has remained constitutionally constrained rather than formally consequential. The specific Republican senators who have broken with Trump on specific votes or joined specific calls for departure represent the most politically significant dimension of the congressional explosion. Without Republican support, any formal removal effort is dead on arrival in the Senate, where a 2/3 majority is required for conviction. The second impeachment trial produced only 7 Republican votes for conviction, and the current political environment suggests that the numbers are not substantially different now. But the very fact that any Republicans are breaking with Trump at all is politically significant, a signal that the president's hold on his party is not as absolute as it once was, and that the accumulated weight of his controversies is beginning to take a toll on even his most loyal defenders. The math of removal is brutal and unforgiving. The impeachment conviction pathway requires a House majority plus 67 Senate votes, a threshold that has never been reached against Trump in either of his 2 completed formal Senate accountability proceedings. The 25th Amendment pathway requires the Vice President plus a cabinet majority plus a congressional backup vote, a mechanism that has never been invoked against any president in American history. Neither mechanism produces the immediate binding step-down result that the most dramatically immediate reading imagines from a single furious congressional explosion. Both pathways require the specific constitutional thresholds, whose achievement most urgently determines whether the formal removal outcome is formally produced. The president's calculated understanding of this constitutional arithmetic is the single most important factor in understanding the defiance posture. Trump knows that the thresholds required for formal removal have not been reached and are unlikely to be reached given the current political dynamics. He knows that the furious congressional explosion, however genuinely alarming in its intensity and organizational development, is constitutionally constrained from producing the formal outcome whose achievement requires thresholds that are currently beyond the documented congressional accountability dynamics. And he knows that this constitutional protection is the most powerful shield available against the accountability actions most urgently pressing for his removal. This is not a president who is stumbling through a political crisis without a plan. This is a president who has calculated the constitutional arithmetic with precision and has concluded that the specific mechanisms available to Congress are insufficient to force his departure without the specific thresholds that the current political environment does not support. The refusal to step down is not a spontaneous emotional reaction. It is a strategic posture, a calculated understanding that the constitutional protections available to a sitting president are powerful enough to withstand the most furious congressional explosion that the current political environment can generate. And that calculation, cold and strategic as it may be, is the single most alarming element of the entire power struggle. The late-night truth social posts have become a defining feature of the current accountability dynamic, each one a fresh expression of defiance that reaches millions of Americans and directly challenges the congressional accountability advocates most urgently pressing for removal. The posts characterizing removal efforts as attacks on democracy and vowing never to step aside are the most publicly accessible expressions of the refuses to step down posture in its most continuously generating current term form. Their real-time quality, the immediacy with which they reach the most accountability-minded congressional members, is the continuously generated element of the power struggle that most urgently establishes why the framing is as actively descriptive of the current accountability dynamic as it is historically descriptive of the most documented prior moments of intensity. The specific true social communications most directly reach the specific congressional members most urgently pressing for removal, creating a direct confrontation that bypasses traditional media filters and speaks directly to the participants in the power struggle. When Trump posts that the removal efforts are attacks on democracy, he is not just speaking to his supporters. He is speaking directly to the lawmakers who are trying to remove him, telling them that their efforts are illegitimate and that he will never acquiesce to their demands. And when he vows never to step aside, he is issuing a direct challenge to the congressional accountability function, daring Congress to use the specific formal mechanisms most directly available for producing the removal outcome. The accumulated intensity of this confrontation is unlike anything we have seen in modern American politics. The floor speeches, the formal articles, the 25th Amendment demands, and the organized removal constituency all represent a congressional explosion that is as real and as formally documented as any political explosion in the modern American presidential accountability record. The 7 articles, the 120-plus members, the 140-member advance vote, all of it constitutes a formal expression of accumulated congressional accountability judgment that the most serious available formal accountability mechanism is warranted by the accumulated presidential conduct. This is not a moment that can be dismissed as political theater or partisan posturing. This is the constitutional process operating at its most intense and most consequential level. The specific formal floor action in which 140 House members voted to advance impeachment articles rather than accept their tabling is the single most consequential formal accountability expression in the current term. 140 members voting on the House floor against the tabling of specific impeachment articles is not a symbolic gesture. It is a formal legislative action that goes into the official record, a measurable expression of congressional will that establishes the organizational scale of the accountability explosion at its most recent and most consequentially formal measurement. The gap between 140 and 218, the 78 additional members most urgently required to produce the formal House impeachment majority, is the specific constitutional arithmetic most urgently determining whether the congressional explosion ever produces the formal majority most directly enabling the most consequential available constitutional advancement of the accountability outcome. The constitutional architecture governing this power struggle is the most important framework for understanding why the explosion has not yet produced the formal removal outcome that the most dramatically immediate reading imagines as having been triggered by a single furious congressional confrontation. The impeachment conviction pathway with its 67-vote threshold, the 25th Amendment pathway with its cabinet invocation requirement, and the constitutional absence of any direct binding congressional step-down vote mechanism together constitute the specific constitutional accountability architecture most directly determining why the congressional explosion has not yet produced the formal removal outcome. Understanding those specific constitutional limits and why the thresholds have never been reached against Trump is the civic accountability education most urgently required for the most honest and most completely grounded engagement with the power struggle. The specific refusal dynamic is not a single moment of confrontation, but a pattern of behavior that has been documented across multiple instances and through multiple mechanisms. The post-January 6th period, when more than 90 Democrats plus a handful of Republicans demanded resignation, impeachment, or 25th Amendment removal, is the specific most documented single refusal to step down moment in the Trump accountability record. The refusal was not delivered in a specific, dramatic, face-to-face congressional confrontation. It was delivered through the distributed mechanisms of public statements, ally communications, and the categorical absence of any resignation action that most directly established the most formally complete available expression of the refuses to step down accountability dynamic in its most authentically documented real-world form. The current term defiance posture is a continuation and intensification of that pattern, with the same categorical refusal to consider any form of departure from power and the same calculated understanding of the constitutional arithmetic most urgently protecting the refusal from the most serious available accountability consequences. The true social posts, the private statements through allies, the public confrontational posture, all of it constitutes a continuously renewed defiance that most directly challenges the congressional accountability advocates most urgently pressing for the specific removal outcomes. And that continuous renewal is what makes the refuses designation not merely a historical description, but an active characterization of the current accountability dynamic. The specific some Republicans breaking with him dimension adds another layer of complexity to the power struggle. The Republican senators who have joined specific calls for departure or broken with Trump on specific votes without reaching the numbers most directly required for formal removal represent the most alarmingly politically significant dimension of the furious Congress explodes element. Republicans who break with Trump on specific votes or join specific calls for departure are performing the most politically consequential available accountability actions within the Republican coalition most urgently required for the formal removal outcome to ever become constitutionally achievable. Each specific Republican who joins a specific removal demand is one step in the specific 10-step gap between the second trial's 7 Republican conviction votes and the 17 most directly required for the 67-vote conviction threshold. The accumulated pattern of specific Republican breaks and specific Republican removal calls, even without reaching the formal conviction threshold, is as alarming in its specific political accountability trajectory as any single dramatic confrontation could be in its most immediately cinematic single-session form. The fact that any Republicans are willing to break with Trump at all, given the political risks of doing so and the power of the president's base within the party, is a signal that the accumulated weight of Trump's controversies is beginning to create fractures within the Republican coalition. Those fractures may not yet be large enough to produce formal removal, but they are significant enough to suggest that the president's hold on his party is not as absolute as it once was. The specific 140-member advanced vote accountability dimension is the formal expression of the accumulated congressional accountability explosion in its most constitutionally consequential available form. Not the single dramatic floor session that the most immediately alarming reading imagines, but the specific formal floor action whose specific documented outcome most directly establishes the specific organizational scale of the congressional accountability explosion at its most recent and most consequentially formal available measurement. And the specific gap between 140 and 218, the 78 additional members most urgently required to produce the formal House impeachment majority, is the constitutional arithmetic most urgently determining whether the congressional explosion ever produces the formal majority most directly enabling the most consequential available constitutional advancement of the accountability outcome. The specific 7-article impeachment resolution accountability dimension is the most comprehensive single formal accountability document in the current second-term record, listing obstruction of power, abuse of the power of the purse, usurpation of trade and war powers, First Amendment violations, unlawful office creation, bribery, and corruption as the constitutional grounds for the most serious available formal accountability mechanism. The resolution is the specific most legally comprehensive dimension of the Congress explodes element. 7 specific constitutional accountability grounds in a single formal resolution is the specific most formally comprehensive available expression of the accumulated congressional accountability judgment that the most serious available formal accountability mechanism is warranted by the accumulated most alarming presidential conduct. The specific 25th Amendment, congressional demands, add the specific, most constitutionally sophisticated dimension of the congressional explosion. The formal letters and resolutions from Democratic members and some Republican voices urging the Vice President and Cabinet to invoke the incapacity declaration mechanism are the specific, most formally organized expression of the most urgently constitutionally available alternative removal pathway. The mechanism whose invocation would most immediately enable presidential power transfer without the multi-step legislative process required by the impeachment pathway. Their specific non-execution by the cabinet required to execute them is the specific, most directly relevant accountability fact for understanding why the explosion has remained constitutionally constrained rather than formally consequential in the specific removal outcome. The specific true social late-night post-accountability dimension is the specific most publicly available and most continuously generating element of the specific defiance posture. Late-night truth social posts vowing never to step aside and characterizing the most organized available congressional removal advocacy as attacks on democracy are the specific most publicly accessible expressions of the specific refuses to step down posture in its most continuously generating current term form. Their specific real-time quality, the immediacy with which they reach the most accountability-minded congressional members, is the continuously generated element that most urgently establishes why the framing is as actively descriptive of the current accountability dynamic as it is historically descriptive of the most documented prior moments of intensity. The specific most important accountability accuracy dimension most urgently requiring honest engagement is the constitutional pathway limitation. The Constitution provides 2 specific formal mechanisms for presidential removal: the impeachment conviction pathway requiring a House majority plus 67 Senate votes, and the 25th Amendment pathway requiring the Vice President plus Cabinet majority plus a congressional backup vote. Neither mechanism produces the specific immediate binding step-down result that the most dramatically immediate reading imagines from a single furious congressional explosion. Both pathways require the specific constitutional thresholds, whose achievement most urgently determines whether the specific formal removal outcome is formally produced. And neither threshold has ever been reached against Trump in either of his 2 completed formal Senate accountability proceedings. The specific calculated quality of the specific presidential defiance most precisely distinguishes the refuse's step-down posture from any ordinary political controversy. The calculated understanding of the specific constitutional arithmetic, most urgently protecting the specific refusal from the most serious available accountability consequence, is the specific most alarming available description of the specific strategic quality of the specific presidential defiance. The specific awareness that the specific formal removal mechanisms most urgently available to Congress are insufficient to formally compel the specific step-down most urgently demanded without the specific constitutional thresholds whose achievement the specific political dynamics most urgently require. A president who refuses most publicly and most defiantly precisely because he most specifically calculates that the specific constitutional arithmetic is the most powerful available protection against the specific congressional explosion's most formal accountability consequences. The specific, most predictably generated response from the specific, most urgently accountability-minded congressional members is the specific, most furious available expression of the specific, most urgently demanded formal accountability actions. The floor speeches, the formal articles, the 25th Amendment demands, and the accumulated organized removal constituency whose specific development most directly reflects the accumulated intensity of the furious congressional explosion. A president who publicly refuses to step down while knowing the constitutional arithmetic is most directly performing the most calculated available version of the defiance posture, the challenge to Congress most directly enabled by the constitutional knowledge that the thresholds required for formal removal have not been reached, and that the furious explosion is constitutionally constrained from producing the formal outcome. The specific dares to try quality is not incidental to the refuse's posture. It is the single most alarming strategic element whose calculation most directly determines why the furious explosion is as intense as it is, while simultaneously being as constitutionally constrained as the thresholds most urgently required for formal removal. A president who publicly refuses to step down while knowing the constitutional arithmetic is challenging Congress to use the specific formal mechanisms most directly available for producing the removal outcome, daring them to try to remove him while knowing that the thresholds required for success have not been reached. The dare is the single most important element of the power struggle, the calculated provocation that generates the most furious congressional response, while simultaneously ensuring that the response cannot produce the formal outcome that would actually remove the president. The specific gap between the congressional explosion and the formal removal outcome is the single most consequential accountability reality of the current power struggle. The explosion is real and as alarming as the most dramatic framing can describe. The immediate binding removal result from that specific explosion is the constitutional impossibility most urgently requiring the most explicit, honest qualification. The furious quality of the congressional response is a genuine expression of political intensity, a mobilization of constitutional tools that represents the most serious effort to remove a president in decades. But the constitutional thresholds required for formal removal remain elusive, and the calculated presidential defiance is grounded in the specific knowledge that those thresholds are unlikely to be reached given the current political dynamics. The specific most honest and most educationally valuable engagement with the refuse's step down, Congress explodes, framing requires the three-part map that most urgently establishes the complete accountability picture. What Trump actually refused, stepping aside, dropping out, resigning, any form of departure from power, is the specific refusal whose categorical and specific publicly defined quality is as completely documented as any presidential accountability refusal in the modern American record. What specific tools Congress is threatening, the 7-article impeachment resolution, the 120-plus member removal constituency, the 25th Amendment demands, the 140-member advanced vote, are as formally documented as any congressional accountability explosion in the modern American presidential accountability record. And why the math is still so brutal: the 67 vote conviction threshold never reached, the 45 Republican procedural votes trying to kill the second trial, the 17 additional Republicans most urgently required is the constitutional arithmetic most directly determining why the furious congressional explosion has not yet produced the formal removal outcome. The specific refusal is documented in the public defiance posture, the statements, the communications through allies, the categorical absence of any resignation action. The furious Congress explodes is documented in the 120-plus members, the 7 articles, the 25th Amendment demands, and the 140-member advanced vote. The math is documented in the 67 vote threshold, the 2 prior acquittals, the gap between the second trial's 7 Republican conviction votes and the 17 most urgently required. And the power struggle between the calculated defiance and the constitutionally constrained explosion is as alarming and as historically significant as the most dramatic single confrontation framing can describe in its most authentically documented real-world accountability form. What makes this specific accountability story as alarming as any single confrontation framing can describe is the specific calculated quality at its core. A president who refuses most publicly, and most defiantly precisely because he most specifically calculates that the constitutional arithmetic most urgently governing the specific formal removal mechanisms is the specific most powerful available protection against the specific congressional explosion's most formal accountability consequences. In a Congress that explodes most furiously, precisely because the specific defiance is the specific most direct available challenge to the specific congressional accountability function that the specific constitutional constraints most urgently prevent from producing the specific formal removal outcome. That is the power struggle. That is the accountability story. And it is as alarming as the most dramatic single confrontation framing can describe. The specific most important thing to understand about the refuses, step-down framing, is the strategic quality of the presidential defiance. It most accurately describes the calculated understanding that the constitutional arithmetic most directly governing the formal removal outcomes is the most powerful available protection against the congressional accountability actions most urgently pressing for those outcomes. A president who refuses to step down is performing the most direct challenge to the congressional accountability function, the assertion that the formal accountability mechanisms most urgently available to Congress are insufficient to produce the accountability outcome. The specific refusal is challenging Congress to achieve through those mechanisms, daring them to try to remove him while knowing that the thresholds required for success have not been reached. The specific true social late-night post-accountability dimension contributes to the refuse's step-down framing's most completely documented real-world basis. The late-night posts, characterizing removal efforts as attacks on democracy and vowing never to step aside, are the most publicly available and continuously generating dimension of the defiance posture. The specific immediacy with which the communications most directly reach the most accountability-minded congressional members most urgently pressing for removal is the most continuously generated element of the power struggle. The defiance is most directly challenging the congressional accountability function in real time, creating a confrontation that is constantly renewed and constantly escalating. The specific 140-member advanced vote accountability dimension is the formal expression of the congressional accountability explosion at its most consequential formal measurement. 140 members voting to advance impeachment articles rather than accept their tabling is not a symbolic gesture. It is a formal legislative action that establishes the organizational scale of the accountability explosion. The gap between 140 and 218, the 78 additional members most urgently required to produce the formal House impeachment majority, is the constitutional arithmetic most urgently determining whether the congressional explosion ever produces the formal majority most directly enabling the most consequential available constitutional advancement of the accountability outcome. The specific some Republicans breaking with him dimension is the most alarmingly politically significant dimension of the furious Congress explodes element. Republicans who break with Trump on specific votes or join specific calls for departure are performing the most politically consequential available accountability actions within the Republican coalition most urgently required for the formal removal outcome. Each specific Republican who joins a specific removal demand is one step in the specific 10-step gap between the second trial's 7 Republican conviction votes and the 17 most directly required for the 67-vote conviction threshold. The accumulated pattern of breaks and removal calls, even without reaching the formal conviction threshold, is as alarming in its political accountability trajectory as any single dramatic confrontation. The specific 3-part map is the most honest and most educationally valuable version of the accountability story. What Trump actually refused, what tools Congress is threatening, and why the math is still so brutal. The refuses is real. The explosion is real. The constitutional constraint is real. And the power struggle between all three is the accountability story most urgently deserving the most honest and most completely grounded engagement. The specific refusal is documented in the categorical public defiance. The specific furious Congress explosion is documented in the 120-plus members, the 7 articles, and the 140-member advanced vote. The specific math is documented in the 67 vote threshold, the 2 acquittals, and the gap between 7 and 17. The specific power struggle between the calculated defiance and the constitutionally constrained explosion is as alarming and as historically significant as the most dramatic single confrontation framing can describe. Delivered through the accumulated defiance and the accumulated explosion, rather than the single cinematic moment that the most immediately alarming reading imagines as having already conclusively defined the outcome. The American accountability story is still unfolding, still developing, still building, toward a conclusion that no one can predict with certainty. The refuses is documented in the public defiance posture. The furious Congress explodes is documented in the formal legislative actions. The math is documented in the constitutional thresholds. And the power struggle between all three is the accountability story most urgently demanding our attention and our most honest engagement. What the Trump refuses to step down as furious Congress explodes on him framing ultimately captures is the specific quality of the ongoing power struggle between a president who calculates that the constitutional arithmetic governs the defiance posture and a congressional accountability constituency whose accumulated organizational development most urgently approaches the formal floor actions, most consequentially advancing the accountability trajectory. The refuses is documented in the public defiance. The furious Congress explodes is documented in the formal actions. The math is documented in the constitutional thresholds. And the power struggle is as alarming and as significant as the most dramatic framing can describe. That is the accountability story. That is the power struggle. And it is the specific, most urgent political development of the current moment.